Welcome to a new episode of BFRR, our Bitcoin, Fiat, and rock and roll podcast that explores the intersection of traditional finance, digital assets, and digital money, and helps you understand how digital assets and digital money will evolve in the future. I'm co-host Michael Blaschke, and today I'm joined by our guest Stefan. Stefan Arnold is lead architect of the SAP Digital Currency Hub, the product SAP has built to bring stablecoin and blockchain-based payments natively into enterprise ERP workflows. Stefan has spent years at the frontier of enterprise-grade payment architecture from SMBs all the way to global enterprises, and he's the person shaping how ERP customers actually unlock the potential of digital money with their core financial processes. He's guided by a principle I genuinely love, that perfection is not achieved when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. Hi, Stefan. Great to have you with us today.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for the invitation. Happy to be in your podcast.
Brilliant. Are you happy with your introduction? Is there anything to add?
Oh, yeah. It's very precise what you described. And the only thing I could add is that it is not just for, let's say, my business life, what you just explained. I'm also very passionate about cryptocurrencies and particularly Bitcoin in my private life. And this is also how things came together. So I was very enthusiastic about Bitcoin, and that led me to SAP and the Digital Currency Hub, where I am now working on the role you just explained. And that is, let's say, a perfect combination for my private interests and also for my business.
Brilliant. It also always feels fulfilling to really combine personal and professional interests in your professional role. So today's episode is really about a tension that I think sits at the heart of institutional digital money right now. On one side of the ecosystem, you have extraordinary stablecoin infrastructure being built by traditional banks like BNY Mellon and JP Morgan, and by native crypto players like Circle and Coinbase. On the other side, you have corporate digital money emerging, PayPal's PYUSD, the growing universe of tokenized real-world assets, and large platforms starting to build their own programmable money layers. And in the middle of all of this, you have thousands of corporate treasury departments and finance teams who are genuinely overwhelmed, I think. The question I want to explore today is, what is the missing piece that allows mainstream enterprise adoption to actually happen? And is IT architecture, the plumbing nobody talks about, at least the conferences I attend, actually one of the most important answers? So the title I envision for today's episode is Crossing the Chasm, How Architecture Unlocks Stablecoin Adoption. And that's exactly where we're going right now. So, Stefan, let me start by painting a little picture for our listeners, and then I want you to tell me whether I've got it right or whether I'm missing something important. So, as I just said, when I look at the stablecoin ecosystem today, I see what feels like two distinct worlds converging from opposite directions. On the infrastructure supply side, you've got traditional financial institutions, so JP Morgan's Kinexys platform, formerly JP Morgan Coin, doing intraday repo and cross-border settlement, BNY Mellon building digital asset custody at institutional scale, and in Europe, players like Societe Generale with the Euro coin vertible, and a growing number of bank-issued e-money tokens coming to market under MiCA. Then on the native crypto side, you've got Circus USDC on multiple chains, Coinbase building custody on off-ramp infrastructure, and Tether's USDT remaining the dominant stablecoin by volume globally, despite all the regulatory noise around it. And then, on what I'd call the demand side of the equation, something new is happening. You've got PayPal with PYUSD trying to turn their payments ecosystem into a settlement rail. You've got the tokenization wave, that is BlackRock's Biddle Fund, Franklin Templeton's on-chain money market fund, the growing interoperability between tokenized deposits and DeFi liquidity. And if you project that trajectory forward, it's not hard to imagine a world where Amazon or Walmart decide they want their own form of programmable corporate money for supply chain settlement. And now, sitting somewhere in the middle of all of this is the CFO of a mid-sized European manufacturing company who has read many white papers, attended many conference panels, and still has no idea what to actually tell his or her treasury team to do on Monday morning. So, Stefan, from your vantage point at SAP, working with enterprise customers across this entire landscape, is that characterization fair? And what does the chasm actually look like in practice when you're sitting across from a real company?
Yeah, first of all, what you explained is completely on point. That's exactly what we need to solve. So we have a lot of amazing startups that build really great products. On the other hand, we have let's say, the treasury departments, CFOs, and other executives that need reliable payment rails. And this is where, let's say, still a bit of a disconnect exists, because we don't need just a perfectly designed Web3 product, but really an end-to-end solution that fits the needs of a large enterprise. And that is way more than just the technical Web3 product itself, because from a treasury perspective, it's a payment product that is cheaper, faster, and transparent, and more fault tolerant, and all these, let's say, qualities. But whether or not that is being using a stablecoin behind the scenes is not super relevant unless you're really in a tech savvy company. So it's mainly about the qualities of the payments, the costs, the speed, the transparency, and all that. And this is where the disconnect still exists. I would say all these startups that build amazing products, they cannot take care of the whole end-to-end solution, because they really need to be very focused. They need to be laser focused on their product. They need to go through different funding rounds, round by round, to deliver their milestones and to deliver what the customers expect. But expecting from a small startup to solve such a large end-to-end solution is way out of scope. And this is why it needs integration partners or anyone else that is putting all that puzzle pieces together. Because at the end, it's the stablecoin itself or the cryptocurrency itself is never the product that a CFO or a treasury department will buy. It's always the end-to-end solution.
Yeah, brilliant. So when you refer to startup, you mean these blockchain native Web3 startups that really were born in and grew in the blockchain native world, and of course are not entirely socialized in the enterprise grade world, and therefore, of course, cannot fully understand the needs and requirements of a treasury team at a enterprise grade or SMB grade business. So is that what you're referring to when you talk about startup?
On the one hand side, yes, of course, but also let's talk about BNY Mellon, for instance. Such large institutional corporations in the meantime also provide their stablecoin platforms. But initially, they need to think outside the box, behave, let's say, a bit unusual for their colleagues. So they need to be like an internal startup. An intrapreneurship, for instance, is an ideal way to get started in such a regulated environment that you can act and innovate independently from all that, let's say, very tough restrictions and obligations such financial institutions have to apply with. And this mixture of being a pure startup and being inside of a large financial institution is, I think, the ideal home turf to get started with new innovation in that area, because it can provide all the legal due diligence, all the customer focus, while being in a, let's say, safe harbor where you also can fail. You need to fail, and that is, I would say, an ideal setup, and this is why we also see that quite often in the meantime. And I would also refer to those kinds of innovation as a startup. But in the meantime, most of these that you just mentioned have already outgrown, I would say, the initial startup phase and became serious products or platforms.
Yeah, I totally understand and agree. So beyond the, let's say, garage startups in Web3 that really start in super small teams without the funding of a mother firm behind it. So beyond these, let's say, crypto native startups, you have the intrapreneurial startups that are well funded. I'm, for example, now thinking of Unity, which is a well funded startup with Galaxy, Flow Traders, and DWS backing it. So I appreciate you adding this nuance of different sources of innovation, blockchain payments innovation or DLT innovation. But nevertheless, I think this chasm or chasm I referred to still holds true. So independent of where it comes from, there is still a gap that needs to be crossed between this innovation emerging bottom up and then, on the other hand, its adoption or consumption. So I know you represented SAP in the annual meeting in Davos, or at least in our SAP house in Davos, close to or associated with the annual forum or annual meeting in Davos. So did you observe this gap of adoption I initially referred to there also? So did you hear statements complaining about this very gap? Yeah.
I think the digital asset space, or in particular stablecoins and all other kinds of tokenized deposits or tokenized cash, became way more serious. And or typically innovation in traditional finance is not that fast as it is in the, let's say, in the decentralized finance area. So it is, I would say, at the speed of light, I would say, compared to traditional finance. And this is also a bit too fast for adopting such new technologies and processes in larger companies, because you also need to have the full audit trail, the legal due diligence and all that. And in such a rapidly evolving environment, it's sometimes hard to estimate whether let's say, the final product really makes it to the market, or are there any constraints? You also need to have a legal framework in place to provide the clarity for the company to really use these stablecoins, and all that became much better in the last year, and all these discussions became much more serious, and it's no longer just the innovators that talk about it. It's also, I would say, close to crossing the chasm, what we were just discussing. And this is mainly because of the disruptive aspect of distributed ledger technologies, I would say, because you are not that used to these blockchain formats, in contrast to IBAN, for instance, where everyone is used to. And you also need a different processes. So for innovators, it's okay if you have a discontinuous innovation where you need to do things differently, but really to make it mainstream, it need to be, let's say, a continuous innovation. And in between, you need to have a solution that absorbs all these disruptive effects. Like one-time addresses, for instance, is a good example. So it's a best practice in the blockchain space to use one-time addresses. It's absolutely normal in Bitcoin, I would say. But for a company, it's very complicated, because usually you set up your payment preferences with your suppliers, and that will never change, or for decades, for instance. You always pay through that particular bank account. But how should you message that address, this blockchain address, securely to your customers? I mean, if you do that by mail, it would be a manual effort nobody wants to do. And all these master data governance processes need to be or automated, or in the very same way as you are used to it. And this kind of disruption is, I would say, still blocking stablecoin innovation from becoming mainstream, and plus a couple of more. But silly things like that, how do I message that? And unless these questions have been solved, or there is a product in between that connects both worlds, it's hard, because the mainstream customers want to have continuous innovation.
Excellent. So, Stefan, I cannot help it. Knowing you attended the Davos annual meeting and represented the firm and our stablecoin thinking there, and I really think you were there in the firm's capacity and not representing your own views only, I guess. So, is there anything else you observed there when it comes to institutional blockchain and stablecoin adoption that you really want to share with the audience? Something that stuck in your mind?
I mean, it can be also a bit of a catalyst event that SAP provides such a solution for stablecoin payments, because that's also, I would say, a massive signal to the market. I mean, if it wouldn't be really serious, regulated, and all that, fulfill all these enterprise qualities, I mean, SAP wouldn't ship such a product. And this was still a surprise for a couple of people I was talking to. They didn't know that so far. And this was really exciting to see how positive the people reacted that I was talking to.
Brilliant. Happy to hear that. So let's go even deeper into the challenges, because I think this is where the story gets both interesting and a bit uncomfortable for everyone who has been saying for years that institutional adoption is just around the corner. So when you were in Davos, or when you're in a workshop with a corporate treasury team or a head of payments, what are the real blockers you encounter? My hypothesis is that the conversation has moved well past, but is blockchain technology real, into something far more operational, like sending one-time addresses, as you just referred to. So is that where you find yourself?
Yes, exactly. So it's no longer the question whether stablecoins will be available in 5 years. I think that question is, in the meantime, no longer relevant. Everyone accepted stablecoins as a serious means of payment, and the discussion really turns more into how do I get started. And it's no longer about convincing all the customers. It's more or less providing a helping hand to get started, to put all these puzzle pieces that we just talked about together. So it's really about getting started. And this is definitely evolving forward. It's more or less approaching all these operational challenges rather than still convincing each and every stakeholder and so on. So that's clear. And also the companies I was talking to face some peer pressure in the meantime, even because if, let's say, a company like PayPal integrates stablecoins in all of their business verticals, that also raises some, I would say, peer pressure. Why is your company not that fast? Why is your company not that cheap or efficient or whatever your competitors are? And this will be, according to my personal opinion, just a matter of time when we see that stablecoin efficiencies raise more and more peer pressure across different businesses.
So there's a framework I keep coming back to when I think about this space. It's Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, which describes the gap between early adopters who are fundamentally risk-tolerant experimenters and the early majority who need something proven, complete, and integrated before they commit. So enterprise blockchain adoption has been stuck in that chasm for the better part of a decade now, I think. And I think what you're describing, this multi-layered challenge of reconciliation, custody, internal alignment, regulatory fit, is precisely why. It's not one problem, it's 6 problems that all have to be solved simultaneously. But here's what I think has changed by now. So the infrastructure on both sides of the chasm has now reached a level of maturity where the bridge can actually be built. The question is whether the industry builds the right bridge or keeps building better trampolines and hoping companies will then jump. So do you think the industry has fully understood what that bridge needs to look like, and specifically when a corporate treasury team actually tries to execute a stablecoin payment today, where does the process break down, technically speaking?
So we see a lot of experiments round about tokenized cash, on-chain finance. That works perfectly fine. but often enough happens inside of, let's say, silos. It's built next to all the payment processes larger enterprises have established. I think it's Siemens, Evonik, and a couple of other large companies that do quite a lot of innovation, and that is really nice to see. But I think it's not yet integrated into their core finance. So it's still separate, still a silo, and to make it really scale, it need to be integrated on eye level with the traditional finance. And this is where, let's say, SAP and the Digital Currency Hub is focusing on, that we really integrate these stable coins on eye level with traditional finance in all the core finance processes, in the payment run, in the account statements, in reconciliation, and all the audit trail and so on, what you just mentioned.
So I want to make sure our listeners, who include architects and IT professionals, get a clear picture of where the architecture breaks down. Are we talking about something at the API integration layer, at the data model level, the way an ERP represents a payment instrument? Is it a custody abstraction problem, or is it actually more conceptual than that the payment processing model in a traditional ERP was designed around batch settlement and banking cutoff times, and blockchain's real-time 24/7 finality doesn't just improve that model, it fundamentally contradicts it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's the, let's say, compatibility, seamless integration. And for instance, usually the payment run integrates with the traditional bank, and that normally happens with a bank file, usually in ISO standardized payment instructions. And as of now, none of these, let's say, crypto companies support such kind of traditional finance. And also for account statements. So you still need to do all that reconciliation manually, or ask a system integrator to build something custom for you in between. Also, with the custodian, these challenges, you need to have that, first of all, this trusted custody institution. In the US, we see quite a lot of qualified custodians. Coinbase, for instance, as one of the most recognized ones, or most known ones. And but that's not everywhere the case. In the US, we see these great custodians, but there are also quite a lot of regions on the planet where you don't have a proper regulation that gives you really the guardrails that you can use stable coins. And it's from an architecture perspective that we don't have a standardized integration model to custodians. It's the missing integration into the enterprise software. And I think these are the key aspects of why these puzzle pieces don't fit together. It's a lack of standardization. And even, let's say, cryptocurrency symbols and standards are just about getting standardized with the Digital Token Identifier Foundation. It's just one of the examples that still need to be established to be really on eye level with the traditional finance. And that is, from a technical perspective, API standards, open authentication, for instance, OAuth, is a really good way for doing authentication and authorization in the internet on HTTP. But there is no such kind of standardization for stablecoin payments. So there is still a lot of standardization to be done for integration purposes with the custodians, for instance, for standardizing stablecoin symbols, like the Digital Token Identifier Foundation, which is standardizing it. So all of these, let's say, small pieces need to be in place to make it really end-to-end usable for the larger enterprises, and not to forget about the let's say, the audit firms like Ernst & Young and other companies need to have their audit services adjusted to stablecoins, which is also still a work in progress, I would say.
Yeah, thank you for outlining these challenges, for explaining the chasm and why the middle is overwhelmed, if you will. So what I'm definitely gonna take with me is aspects like a disconnect between blockchain wallet abstractions and ERP payment orders, the absence of deterministic reconciliation between on-chain transaction hashes and internal payment references, or the challenge of managing custody in an enterprise controls environment. But first and foremost, really the lack of native stablecoin support in standard ERP payment engines that most, if not all, companies simply use for their payment processing. So I now want to shift to something I find genuinely fascinating: the behavioral and organizational differences between the companies that have already started adopting stablecoin payments and the much larger group that will eventually follow them. Because I think understanding that gap is essential to understanding what needs to be built. Stefan, in your work, you're engaging with companies across the full adoption spectrum. So what does an early adopter actually look like in practice? What kind of company, what use case, what were they willing to tolerate to get there?
So innovators typically look for challenges, or not for challenges, for opportunities to become a thought leader, to differentiate themselves from let's say the majority. And they usually are very tech savvy. They spend time in their private life with these innovative things, and it's absolutely okay for them that they don't have, let's say, a handbook written like a product, written like the ones for products that exist for decades. So that's absolutely okay for them. And these innovators, they also are providing very important feedback, and because they're very close to the technology, they provide really good feedback, in fact. And the more and more it gets adopted into, let's say, core enterprise frameworks, the audience typically is changing. So we see then more and more treasury colleagues joining that discussion, and also these projects becoming much bigger. And then you're back in a situation where you have a lot of feedback and requirements from a lot of different departments, and then it starts getting big. And then you need to address a lot of technical questions, process questions, compliance questions, and so on. And this is where innovators and let's say the mainstream adopters come together in large companies, because that happens inside of a large company. You have always some innovative colleagues, some enthusiasts in these companies, and they often enough drive that, let's say, stablecoin adoption internally. And then you have that chasm inside that particular company. This is also quite interesting to see. This is really the status quo, so to say. We're talking about stablecoins with a lot of customers, and we're getting started with a lot of projects in parallel at the moment. So it became serious, and then it's getting serious by raising all these, or answering all these questions around about processes and integration and so on.
Yeah, I appreciate you adding this nuance on the individual level within any given organization. That is, even within an early adopter organization, there might be front runners and then laggards that need to cross a chasm between themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But if you're also, you can be a very small company and much more agile and open to embrace stablecoins than such large companies, because you have also not so many obligations to fulfill. You have not so many levels of management tiers and so on that you need to convince. So decision making is usually way faster in smaller companies, and this is why we currently also see smaller companies taking the lead in adoption. And we also see the larger companies adopting stablecoins, but it will still take a bit until all these projects will hopefully come successful.
Staying on the organization level now, so early adopter organizations, in my experience, large multinationals or tech-forward corporates are these early adopters. So there are specific use cases like cross-border B2B payments to reduce foreign exchange friction and correspondent banking costs, intra-company cash repatriation from markets with currency controls or weak banking infrastructure, or supply chain payments where settlement speed has working capital implications. And what I observe is a willingness to build custom integrations and accept some manual reconciliation processes. But then, now moving to the individual level, there's often an effort driven by a single internal champion, often a forward-thinking CFO or head of treasury transformation. So is this attempt in describing early adopter organizations fair?
Exactly. So, for instance, I was talking to a customer in Switzerland, and they so far had a traditional licensing model for their software. So I'm talking about a software company. It's a small software company providing add-ons to SAP solutions. And they had a traditional licensing model where a customer bought a license and paid on an annual basis for that. But they turned their product into a SaaS product, which is subscription-based billing on a monthly basis. So the invoice amounts are way smaller than they had been before, and the payment cadence is much higher than it was before. And they even sold their product to Latin America or to Africa. And what this customer told us was that this could be even a showstopper for them, because the African customers or Latin American customers sometimes pay $20 to $30 in transaction costs for that $50 invoice. And this could be even a showstopper for them, just because the payment rail is not efficient enough. And then they had a really forward-looking CEO that was very interested in using stablecoins and also Bitcoin. And this can be then the kind of thought leadership and proof of concept that you really need to show that it really works in everyday payment processes.
Yeah, that matches exactly what I've observed. The early adopters are almost always pulled in by a very specific quantifiable pain point. It's not a vision, but a problem they can no longer afford to ignore. And in the European context, that pain point is often cross-border payments into and out of markets where traditional correspondent banking is expensive, slow, or simply unreliable. Yeah, I've spoken to European companies with operations in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa, where the cost of moving money through traditional rails is so significant that a stablecoin solution, even one that requires significant internal effort to implement, has a clear and immediate business case. But here's a tension I observe. It's the late maturity, the thousands of European mid-market companies that will eventually need to make this transition. They can't operate the way early adopters do. They don't have a crypto-native IT team. They don't have someone who understands the difference between a hot and a cold wallet, and they shouldn't need to. So here's my question. Is the leap from early adopter solution to something the late maturity can use primarily a product design challenge? Is it a process design challenge or something more fundamental? Because my intuition is that the late maturity doesn't just need a better version of what early adopters build. They need something that feels like it was always there in their SAP system. No new mental models, no new workflows, just payments that happen to settle on a blockchain.
Yes, exactly. So from a Web3 startup perspective, always the stablecoin is the product, and the innovator customers will buy that stablecoin techie product. But the majority is buying a payment solution that works end to end, and it really need to be seamlessly integrated into the software that they are used to. They don't want to have the silo for stablecoins in parallel to traditional finance. And this is or this cannot be solved by, let's say, a tech-only product, but really by a seamless integration, let's say, through standardization, seamless integration, and that needs, standardization is probably the key word for it.
Yeah, so there's something almost paradoxical about mass adoption of blockchain technology and stablecoin payments in the enterprise context. The early adopters we talked about, those multinationals with front-running, thought-leading CEOs or CFOs, so those early adopters already proved or are in the process of proving the concept, but the conceptual framework they used to get there, thinking about wallets, about gas fees, about private keys, about on-chain versus off-chain state, that framework is actually a barrier to the next wave of adoption. The late majority of adopters doesn't want to be educated about blockchain. They want their existing processes to work better. The technology needs to become invisible. Do you think the industry has truly internalized that, or are we still, broadly speaking, building tools that require users to think at least a little bit like crypto natives?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. Yeah, so the knowledge about cryptocurrencies and stablecoins need to be, let's say, hidden as much as possible, and all these disruptive aspects of stablecoins, like the addresses and so on. I mean, you, for instance, know your counterparty, you know the legal identifier, for instance, and the system need to take care of messaging the addresses, suggesting you to switch to a faster and cheaper payment rail, but you don't need, or you should not need to go through all these, let's say, smart contract addresses and all that, but it needs to be really integrated end to end, and that also includes probably a house bank. So we see a lot of traditional banks supporting cryptocurrencies in Germany, at least, and that also can be leveraged for stablecoin mass adoption in the business context. We see quite a lot of adoption of cryptocurrencies, but mainly by private persons for speculative reasons, by investment companies that, let's say, invest a bit into Bitcoin, a percentage or something. And but having your house bank supporting stablecoins can be also a very important key point for the business adoption of stablecoins, because all these mid-market customers, they know their banking contact persons probably since decades, and they don't put the relationship to these trusted contact persons and the banks at risk just for being a bit faster or slower. So I think for mass adoption, we definitely need the house banks to support the stablecoins, that the companies can use stablecoins from where they are today, that they don't need to move to a different custodian, but the stablecoins are becoming available at the house bank. Then the enterprise software, on the other hand, on the upstream side, so to say, need to support it. Then probably advisory firms around these mid-market companies need to be educated all around. And these are, let's say, the things that need to change for mass adoption. These things that you usually would hide in a advanced settings environment for some tech-savvy people, and stablecoin and blockchain details would be the advanced settings probably that you never want to open, but trust the systems that you use. And this is the level of convenience and trust we need to have, getting the people onboarded from where they are today.
Thank you, Stefan. So we spent a fair amount of time on the very challenge, the problem space, on what that chasm is and why crossing it is that challenging. Let's now move to architecture as a potential missing link. So to solution, SAP's approach for crossing that chasm and the road ahead. Yeah, and let me come to what I believe is an underrated topic in the entire institutional digital money conversation, and that's the IT architecture layer. I've been calling it a sleeper topic, and I want to explain what I mean by that. So at conferences, in panels, in roundtables, the conversation is often about regulation, about liquidity, about whether Circle or JP Morgan will dominate the stablecoin market. Almost nobody is talking about the ERP integration layer. And I think that in 5 years, when we look back at how stablecoins actually crossed the chasm, it's going to be obvious that the architecture question was where the battle was then actually won or lost in everyday organizational operations. Stefan, help me make that concrete for our listeners. What does well-architected stablecoin integration into an enterprise financial system actually look like? Not the aspirational vision, but really the technical and functional architecture that makes it work for a company doing genuine B2B payments at scale.
That starts, I would say, with the cash positions or the treasury overview or the cash overview in the enterprise software or in the ERP system. And the treasury department, they work on a daily basis, of course, in their treasury module, and they see their cash forecast and all that. And it starts with integrating stablecoins where the treasury departments work today. And what the SAP Digital Currency Hub is doing is integrating the stablecoin and the stablecoin custodian in a seamless way and the exact same way how a traditional finance institution is integrated. So you see your US dollar holdings next to your USDC holdings or your PayPal USD holdings at a Coinbase, for instance. And that is where things get started. And then you have your, let's say, stablecoin payment method. So it doesn't need to be a different currency because the stablecoins are pegged to the US dollar everyone trusts or to the European euro. And this is why the currency must not change, but only the payment method. And next to that is the payment run. At the moment, company typically receives all the invoices either electronically or on paper, and then they will be scanned and they will be put all together in a very large payment run. And let's say at the end of a month or whatever period, a company or particular larger companies, they pay thousands of invoices in one shot. And this kind of integration is where you need to integrate with the stablecoin to really make it scale across all the business verticals. Because regardless of whether you do some travel and expense payments or supplier payments, employee bonus payments or whatever, typically that is routed or funneled into the enterprise software. And then you have these, let's say, larger payment runs or batches. And this is where the magic happens. This is where really a lot of money is being transferred. And let's assume that I, as a supplier or the system, can suggest to switch to a stablecoin payment because the counterparty is known. I know the legal entity identifier, the Duns and Bradford number or whatever of my counterparty, and then the system could decide on its own that doing the stablecoin payment is more efficient. And if there would be an interoperability protocol for enterprise software systems, for instance, or an agent-based solution that these agents or systems can exchange the addresses where you would like to get paid on, exchange in a trusted and secure way, then it could really scale in a way that is currently not possible because we see a lot of manual efforts and manual processes and isolated solutions. And this level of integration is needed, and that requires, I would say, standardization and common protocols like X402 for agent-based payments. And this is really where it needs to be integrated. Payment run, for instance, the account statements, because so far you receive, let's say, a payment manually at Coinbase or wherever, then you need to reconcile that manually against your open positions in the ERP system because there is a disconnect and there is no way to report your incoming blockchain transactions let's say, from MetaMask in the worst case, from an enterprise perspective, into your enterprise software. Someone need to monitor that MetaMask wallet and need to close the open positions manually in the ERP system by providing manual input. And all that is very failure prone and not really secure from a process perspective. There can happen a lot of fraud and manipulation in between. And all these processes need to be automated and standardized across company boundaries, that ideally systems or agents can negotiate on these payment terms automatically, that you as an accountant don't need to spend much attention to that, because they can provide you a discount, for instance, if you use a stablecoin payment over a fiat payment and so on. There is just less money on the move, I would say, because usually a payment takes 2 or 3 days. So the working capital efficiency can be improved for all kinds of companies, I would say.
So you're here giving a sketch of a well-architected stablecoin integration into an enterprise financial system. What's striking to me about this draft architecture, if you will, you're describing, is that it faces 2 directions simultaneously. Looking outward to the blockchain ecosystem, it has to be flexible enough to work with Circus USDC, with bank-issued stablecoins, potentially one day with a digital euro if the ECB actually gets there, and ideally without the company having to re-architect everything every time a new asset or a new provider emerges. And then looking inward, secondly, toward the enterprise, it has to integrate so seamlessly with existing ERP processes that the people executing payments never have to interact with the blockchain layer directly. That is genuinely a hard architectural problem to solve. So ERP vendors in general and our team at SAP has been working on exactly this problem through the Digital Currency Hub. And I know you've been doing hands-on workshops with custodians, exchanges, stablecoin issuers, partners, and predominantly customers. So without turning this into a product presentation, what are the architectural principles that emerged from that work and what surprised you along the way?
So after a couple of customer workshops, it became very clear to us that we need to have something like a banking proxy in between the enterprise software and the very rapidly evolving Web3 environment, because at the, let's say, ERP system, innovation takes way more time than you would be able to drive outside of the ERP system. So it was clear we cannot build that into the ERP system itself, but need to isolate that because of the crazy speed of the innovation in the Web3 area. And this let's say banking proxy, the SAP Digital Currency Hub, is mimicking what a traditional bank does against the enterprise software and translates that into the blockchain language. So it's the bridge between Web3 and the enterprise world. And that, let's say, a proxy architecture model outside of the enterprise software, I think, was really outstanding and very unique so far.
Yeah, so the principle you're really describing here, it would then be labeled or called like mimic an intermediary bank, which is not an intermediary because it's a piece of software, which is a beautiful way of crossing the chasm or bridging the on-chain and off-chain worlds, and that you use software to mimic a role or an intermediary that was previously enacted by a traditional bank. And this job is now being done by a software.
Correct. And we're streamlining, I would say, all kinds of different custody integrations, from large to small, from niche to mainstream, from stablecoin to tokenized cash or whatever. Everything gets streamlined into a unified traditional banking interface. And that works perfectly fine. So you don't need to really invest a lot into integration products. It's rather just configuring your preferred custodian, and then it's ready to go out of the box.
Yeah, let me ask you something more speculative, because I think our listeners appreciate when we push beyond the present state into where this actually is heading. If you look at the ecosystem we sketched at the beginning of our conversation, so the traditional bank stablecoin rails, the native crypto infrastructure, the corporate coins, the tokenized RWAs, and you imagine all of that maturing and converging over the next 3 to 5 years, what does enterprise digital money architecture look like at the other end of that journey? Are we moving toward a world where companies have one unified integration layer that abstracts away the complexity of multiple stablecoin networks and asset types? Or is fragmentation really the long-term reality? And if so, how does a CFO navigate all of that?
I think the fragmentation would be a no-go in the mid to long term because of that additional level of complexity. What we hear today is that companies struggle with all these banking integrations. They have to maintain, for instance, or assume that you're a multinational company, then you might have 10, 50, or even 100. I heard from customers that have 120 banking integrations across the globe. And this is, of course, something that you would not like to replicate in the Web3 environment or stablecoin space. So I think the key value proposition of stablecoins and Web3 based products need to be a simplification, a streamlined infrastructure, and therefore I don't think that fragmentation is acceptable, not from a pure technical perspective, but also from a stablecoin perspective. We see more and more stablecoins coming up, but this fragmentation of liquidity is also something that customers that we talk to don't like too much. In the end, it will have to be like the smartphone market. You see Samsung, for instance, and Apple being dominating the market, but there are way more brands around. But seriously, it's 2 or 3 that will dominate the market, and we will probably see something likewise in the stablecoin space. So also that fragmentation will probably sort out, because it's also hard from a differentiation perspective for a stablecoin, because they are usually standardized around ERC20. So it's hard for them to differentiate. And also from a yield perspective in the US and also in Europe, it's always forbidden to provide yields to the holders of the stablecoins, or also there is not much of an option to differentiate. And this is why we believe that the fragmentation will need to be prevented.
All right. So I want to now close with something that I think puts the scale of our whole conversation in perspective. SAP system run the financial operations of a significant portion of the global economy, from mid-sized European manufacturers to really global multinationals. The aggregate volume of value flowing through SAP's payment and treasury modules is extraordinary. And what that means is that getting the architecture right for stablecoin integration into that ecosystem is potentially a structural shift in how global B2B commerce settles value. So the stakes are genuinely high in crossing that chasm in what SAP or ERP vendors in general do to cross that chasm. So Stefan, final question from my end. For the finance professionals, the IT architects, and the treasury leaders listening to this today, what's the one thing you'd want them to walk away with? So not a technology recommendation or a product pitch, but a mind shift or an action that would make the biggest difference for them in how they approach this space.
Yeah, get started small, probably with a use case like intra-company repatriation, because then you don't need to convince a supplier. So you can get started with that on your own and just doing it intra-company. Let's say if you have multiple subsidiaries, you can move money around the globe just within your financial department. That would be a really great starting point. And once you're, let's say, familiarized with all of that, then you can expand that to further use cases like your investments. So you could, let's say, invest a bit into tokenized money market funds or even cryptocurrencies. And this would be something that at least I would appreciate if we see more innovators joining the stablecoin adoption. Make it real, make it happen, convince treasury departments, convince counterparties to accept stablecoins, keep stablecoins in circulation, plan ahead of that, see that more from a holistic perspective, make your department or your treasury department ready for the decentralized economy.
Oh, that was a bunch. Thank you so much for these pragmatic recommendations on how to cross that chasm. Yeah, so as referred to a lot in this episode, the title of the very episode is Crossing the Chasm, How Architecture Unlocks Stablecoin Adoption. And I think we've shown that the chasm is real, but it is crossable. The stablecoin infrastructure on both sides of the ecosystem has matured to the point where genuine enterprise adoption is now a technical and organizational challenge. It's not a technology readiness question, at least not anymore. And the companies that invest in getting their architecture right in the next 2 to 3 years, choosing integration layers that abstract away blockchain complexity, that fit seamlessly into their existing ERP workflows, and that are built for regulatory compliance from the ground up, those companies will have a genuine structural advantage in how they move, settle, and manage value in an increasingly digital global economy. The architecture question is the sleeper topic to me, and I think after today's conversation, it won't be sleeping for much longer. Thanks for listening to Bitcoin, Fiat, and Rock and Roll, and for making it until the end of this episode. Thanks to all the co-hosts and the excellent guests like Stefan, Arnold for their takes and insights. If you enjoyed the podcast, please recommend and rate us. That helps us the most. Connect with us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and our expert community on Telegram, both in German and English. For details, consult the show notes. Stefan, by the way, you are invited to join this very expert community to then face all the questions that will naturally emerge. And to our audience, visit our website for detailed analysis and detailed show notes. Make sure to subscribe to BFRR wherever you get your podcast and join us next week when we'll be exploring another critical development in the evolution of digital finance. Until then, this is BFRR bringing Europe's perspective on institutional DLT to the world. Thank you and goodbye.
The views expressed are solely the personal opinions of the hosts and are provided for informational purposes only. This podcast does not offer financial or investment advice. Always conduct your own research and make well-informed decisions before investing. Please be aware that the hosts and guests may hold cryptocurrencies or digital assets discussed in this episode.